Hi everyone, and welcome to the first supply chain talk of the year. Welcome to 2022. We've had a break over Christmas. It was great to have some time off, and we're now back focusing yet again on supply chain and the challenges and the issues and the opportunities probably that appear for us all as we go forward through the year. Those of you who joined us at the back end of last year will remember that the last session I think we had was on sustainability in distribution, which was a really interesting focus on the things that we can do to really drive sustainability forward through distribution and through warehousing. And this week, we're really happy to come back to the issue of supply chain disruption. We know it's still with us, but hopefully this week, as we look forward, we're going to be looking a lot more about the things that we can do and the opportunity to cope with disruption. Maybe some of the things that we can do to offset some of the challenges that we know will continue to offset us as we go forward. So delighted to be able to have that conversation with you today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Duncan Brock. I have the honour of hosting these supply chain talk sessions. I'm really looking forward to a good discussion today. I've got a couple of guests joining me, and both have got some real great insights and knowledge in supply chain and procurement. So I'll be delighted for them to join me. And please do join in. Those of you who are here joining us live, use the chat function. See some people have already put some comments in there, so welcome to you. Say where you're from, what country you're from, what part of the UK you're from, but also Q&A. Please do, if you feel the opportunity to want to ask any of us any questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that I pick them up and share them and hopefully get them answered as we go through today's session. So really looking forward to an interactive session as we go forward today. The one thing as an incentive to you as well is that if you really want to get the right, get your hands on one of these things called the Supply Chain Talk mug. I'll put it in the camera properly. They are there, and one each week goes to the best comment or best chat or best question that we get from the audience. So if you want to get your hands on this unique, well, not quite unique, but Supply Chain Talk mug, please do so. I know last year we had a couple of supply chain issues in getting the mugs to people, but I know one of Ashley, who's a real good contributor to Supply Chain Talk, did actually get his mug last year, which was back into last year, which was great. So join in, let's get involved, and let's make the most of this Supply Chain Talk this week. So we're focusing on supply chain disruption, and we've got a couple of guests, and I'd like to bring our first guest in, which is Laura Hobbs. So Laura, if you could sort of join us, welcome to you. Laura is currently a procurement consultant, but she's also been a sort of expert in procurement and supply chain, particularly in the construction sector. And she's also, up until very recently, been the chair of the SIP's Construction Senior Leaders Group. We get together on a regular basis to talk about the common issues and challenges in procurement and supply chain and construction. And Laura's been the chair of that for us for the last couple of years. So Laura, welcome to you.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you for the invite today. I could say I was surprised to be invited to this particular topic, but as Duncan knows, I've been doing an awful lot of work in this subject over the last few years, so I'm sure we all have. It's been a real focal point for me, so thank you for inviting me, and hopefully I can share some insight and learning from the last few years.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. As you say, I know it's a focal point for you, and we'll probably come into some of those specific challenges in construction as we go through the discussion today, because we know construction sector particularly has had some severe issues and supply chain shortages, which I know you were centre of trying to resolve some of those over the last sort of 18 months or so. So, well, we'll come to that. I'm sure it'll be good to explore a bit more of that with you as we go forward. But one of the things I want to start with, though, is there's we like to pick up a sort of topical news story, but I think every week it's quite easy to choose a news story about supply chain. But the one this week is talking about chaos is the new normal for supply chain. And it's a sort of probably it's an overview article which says that actually, you know what, at the moment, supply chain constraints will continue. I think China's just announcing some new lockdown measures, and what's that going to do to the manufacturing base and supply chains in China. It's talking about the fact that there'll be ongoing shocks through the system, whether that's ongoing issues with chip shortages or Ukraine or tariffs and challenges around that. But also looking forward, it does say that actually very much that logistics and supply chain is central now to business and business strategy, and that we're getting, I suppose, as supply chain experts more involved now in business strategies and discussions around them than ever before, which has been great. But I think really interesting in the back end of the article was the fact that it says that sustainability could well be the next shock. That actually, as companies really grasp the challenges of reducing things like Scope 3 emissions down through their supply chains, that they're really going to have to reshape things and do things in a very different way, which could well be the next shock that happens down through the supply chains themselves. So, very challenging, but also at the same time probably insight into what we're all facing at the moment. I mean, an interesting, Laura, in your perspective on where we're at in this sort of sense that chaos is the new normal for us in supply chains going forward.
I was going to say the article that you picked has the perfect title, Chaos is the New Norm. For those of you outside the UK, not only did we have the volatility of the pandemic and the supply chain reacting to that, but we were also one of the few industries that were asked to actively stay open whilst manufacturers shut. So that kind of brought different challenges. Now add Brexit to the mix. You have the perfect storm. So chaos, for me, has been the last 2 years. But the report is right. Uncertainty is the new certain. And we have to get used to that. And we have to now kind of find different ways to deal with the uncertainty. And I think I've always said every crisis and uncertainty is an opportunity for procurement and supply chain to shine. And now more than ever, we are needed to really help manage the business continuity within our own businesses and also shape the future of the business's strategy. You mentioned sustainability. That's going to be the next key topic that procurement and supply chain are going to be at the front of.
So, I mean, you reflected there on some of the challenges that we faced, when everything went into lockdown and the trying to get suppliers to supply. But I mean, if I look at construction at the moment, particularly, you still got supply chain constraints, haven't you? You're still facing some quite significant shortages. So we're certainly, we're not out of the situation in any way, shape, or form at the moment, are we?
Not at all, no. There's been a couple of things that have crept up, and some of those aren't actually a direct result of COVID and the pandemic. So we have obviously a PVC shortage, which means plastic pipes are a problem. Would you actually have thought as well that the current increase in timber, I think it's something like over 70% increase over the last 12 months, that some of that was actually due to us all being at home doing home improvements? So it just exacerbated the already, the already problems that we're experiencing around demand and supply. Well, add Joe Bloggs wanting to do some fencing or do some decking to make sure he had a really nice area to sit outside in. It sometimes isn't directly affected. So we have to be really aware of these changes, and they happen on a monthly basis in construction. We have to be really kind of close to our suppliers and really close to the sort of up and coming knowledge of what's happening in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I know that they've just posted some of the PMI results and so on, and the news articles associated with those in the chat for people to review. But I mean, let's bring the construction one to life. I mean, those of you who don't know the PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, is a monthly survey that we do in construction, manufacturing, and services sector. We measure a whole number of different factors in there, and then we've got this amalgam of what the overall are we growing? Are we reducing in terms of the sector itself? Now, construction at the moment is just above 50. So, generally, construction sector is doing better than it was and growing. But when you look specifically at some of the indices that sit behind it, I was pulling out the fact that delivery lead times, if 50 is normal, delivery lead times are down at 32. So well below where they should be for sort of everyone going, this is normal. And that's better than it was 2 or 3 months ago. But then the other factor there was inflation. I think inflation is, if 50 is normal, 100 to the top, price inflation was about 82 or 83. So you can just see there that we've still got shortages and we've got inflationary pressures coming through as well. And that's still probably quite a major impact in the construction sector in particular.
It is very much. I don't think I've ever been so shocked at seeing price increases that we've seen over the last 12 months. We used to be an industry that was really driving just in time. We're now in a very sort of fragmented supply chain, having to work with our suppliers to ensure that they're ordering months in advance. And that has its challenges because we're not a cash-rich industry. The cash flow going down the supply chain is a real issue. So we've had to work with our suppliers in a slightly different way. Sometimes we actually have pre-ordered ourselves and pre-issued. And this is just a number of different ways that you have to kind of work with your business to work out what risk mitigations you're going to use to deal with the ever-ending issues that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think Trudy just posted as well some of the main results and so on. But I think someone said to me the other day that and we'll probably come back to this theme of, you've got to keep looking at the supply chain, aren't you? You've got to keep looking at the drivers of demand, and as you say, who else is consuming stuff in this space that's causing these constraints and these issues? Because you talked about home improvements and the impact on timber, but then you've got furniture producers having shortages because they can't get the wood to make the furniture, and their prices are escalating as well. So it's that knock-on effect from one sector to the other that I think we've seen it like this before at this level, of that sort of rolling impact across various sectors.
Yeah, I mean, you look at logistics as an example, and particularly around drivers, the lack of drivers that I think the whole industry experienced, not just construction specific. In fact, if you look at our needs compared to the rest of the other industries, we're actually really low on the please give us some drivers. But actually, we're going to experience this problem again in another 5 to 7 years, because the age demographic of these drivers is only going one way. So we know that's coming. So how are we going to work together? How are we going to change our logistics structure to really kind of incorporate the biggest risk that is about to hit us again?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know particularly in construction, getting people to want to deliver into cities is probably one of the biggest challenges as well. Just that whole challenge and logistics around that, which could probably be a whole topic in itself that we could get to, Laura. So I actually like to bring our other guest in if I can. John Glenn is going to join us as well. John, I think hopefully a number of you have seen him previously in other sessions of Supply Chain Talk and other webinars. He's a visiting fellow of Cranfield University, or Cranfield School of Management, sorry, John. But he's also an economist that works very closely with us at SIPS. And John, delighted for you to join us today.
Thank you, Duncan. Pleasure to be here.
So John, I know whenever I speak to you, you've got a very sort of good perspective on the supply chain logistics disruption that's going on around the patch, and it's coming back to this view that this is going to be an ongoing challenge for supply chains and the chaos that's around it. What's your take on this? What's your view of this economic impact and the way forward for us in supply chain?
Well, as Laura said, we're trying to define a new normal in this space in a chaotic environment. But I think we really need to start with that fundamental point that Laura made right at the beginning of her comments. And that's the centrality of the effectiveness of supply chains to businesses. So many businesses, Laura talked about just in time, essentially assumed that the supply chain would always work. Okay. Many businesses that I work with, use this phrase that supply chain is critical but not core. If it doesn't work, our business doesn't work, but it's not core to what we do because it's worked so well, or we've contracted it out to a third party to look after that for us. Now, what we actually see is the criticality of the supply chain becoming evident because the supply chain has broken down and is in chaos. And that's what gets the attention of the C-suite, and it's in the article. Now the chief supply chain officer or the chief procurement officer all of a sudden is being invited into the boardroom and is being required to solve the problem. So what are the issues that we then face? I think Laura outlined them quite clearly. We've got a situation where the supply chain is fractured. because we can't move goods, we can't get goods through ports, mainly due to COVID, although, as Laura said, we've added the complexity of Brexit. And I think on an ongoing basis, I think I used a phrase when I was speaking on behalf of SIPS to one of the national newspapers, that the cloak of COVID is going to disappear and then reveal to us some of the challenges that we face with Brexit in terms of the transition period and readiness for Brexit. And indeed, there was an ONS survey that came out just before Christmas that showed about 10% of UK organisations actually feel that they're ready for the end of the transition period in Brexit and moving goods as far as that's concerned. But then we've got this situation where procurement and supply chain professionals are faced with the challenges of a fractured supply chain and therefore resilience in terms of supply and ensuring that we've actually got supply. And then that conflating to generate inflation and the type of inflation that Laura talked about. The recent producer price index suggests that prices are going up on average by 10%. And if you look at some of the sectors, transportation, fuel and energy, those increasing costs are enormous. And that's getting passed on both throughout the supply chain and into the ultimate consumer. And then the last point I think that Laura mentioned, particularly about the implications on cash flows for organisations, is really quite a critical but subtle point. And it is incredibly taxing, as it were, on small and medium-sized organisations that haven't got the balance sheet to be able to cover for the supply chain fractures with their cash flows. So that's the kind of environment that we find ourselves in, and that's the challenge that's facing procurement and supply chain professionals going forward.
No, doesn't sound like a challenge at all, John. I think it's. I think the way you phrase it is, there's so much underlying issues there, and I think one of the questions that John Richards just posted is, with restrictions in the UK being lifted next week, is COVID no longer a threat to the economy? Which I think is an interesting take on restrictions are lifted, but we've still got absence levels. We've still got people homeschooling because kids are off school because of COVID. We've still got challenges down through the supply chain. And I think in previous episodes, we've also talked about the shortage of skills that we've actually, people have sat back and gone, do I want to do this role? Do I want to work in this environment? So probably, John, I'd say our answer would probably be no, but I'd be interested, Laura and John, in your comments on that.
Well, I would probably say, unfortunately, no. I don't see this going away just because we changed some restrictions that were put in place. Okay, well, we might all go back to work, but we've always been at work in construction. However, as Duncan said, there is a big problem within the industry around a skills shortage in general. Add to that Brexit and a lot of employees moving back to their European countries. And then add to that the fact that, I can do remote working, I can change my career, I can do something different. Why would it be attractive, particularly in the construction industry, to go and stand outside in the cold and dig a hole? So we don't see that challenge. And unfortunately, even with some of those restrictions being lifted, that won't change for us. We're still going to have sickness levels and lack of skills on site.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I think the sort of great resignation or the great rotation, whatever you want to call it, is an issue that many organisations are going to have to face in terms of, how do we attract employees? I think Laura's right; it's exacerbated by Brexit and a shortage of those workers, particularly in certain industries, and I would imagine construction is definitely one of those. But also we have to look at the pandemic becoming an endemic, or the pandemic still spreading throughout the rest of the world. And particularly if we look at the Chinese attitude to Omicron, where you've seen massive shutdowns of their economy. Ningbo's been closed down, one of the busiest ports in the world. Close that down for 2 or 3 weeks and it has massive dislocation. We see figures I've seen recently, about 12% of the global carrier capacity is at port or waiting to be at port. That's normally 4%. So, you take that capacity out of global supply chains and you see the kind of effect that Laura talked about earlier, where you have to plan 3 or 4 months ahead. because, you know, carriers at the moment are running 35% on schedule. They normally run at 80 to 85% on schedule. So you've got that massive dislocation in the supply chain caused by COVID outside of the United Kingdom.
So I think we're saying, you know, we're not out of the woods, and I think that's clear. And also, we've just seen another question that's come in from Neil Tuckman. So thank you for that, Neil. It's more on the comment about inflation. I mean, I think, you know, we've already said that it's there, and his question is about, you know, the fact that it's, you know, heading towards 6%. I mean, John, you talked about producer price index being near 10%. But I think, what's your view on where you think it's heading, particularly the timing? And as it seems a slowdown is inevitable, will inflation have to be brought under control? So I think that's probably more for the economist in terms of a question there, John. But you know, inflation is running high. It seems like it's going to continue to run high. And will there have to be some interventions to more with things like interest rates and others to try and bring inflation back, or is it just inevitable that it'll work its way through and we'll get to maybe a higher price level but less inflation?
So if I was sitting on the Monetary Policy Committee, in my mind, if I'm looking at interest rates increasing, I'm asking, is there a fundamental situation where the level of demand in the economy is running ahead of the level of supply in a normalized kind of ability to supply? Okay. And at the moment, you'd actually say that any inflation that's being caused is because of a fracture on the supply side, which we'd expect to be corrected over time. Now, the discussion today has said that that correction is going to be difficult, it's going to be chaotic, it's going to require a new normal being defined, and it may take an amount of time. But what you don't want to do is put interest rates up, dampen the demand side of the economy, and actually cause the economy to collapse as it recovers. And we've recovered quite well. You know, we are in Q1 this year, we will be at a level of GDP, real GDP, which is equivalent to where we were at the end of 2019. So the recovery has been relatively V-shaped, and we don't want to dampen that down. But at the same time, if we start to see actions in the economy which are perpetuating the inflation, so we see inflationary wage increases, and you have to be as old as me to remember a wage price spiral. You know, we're now going back to stuff that happened in the 70s and 80s and maybe the early 90s. Then if they see that happening, they'll put interest rates up to try and dampen things down. But if they think it's a temporary increase in inflation that's going to work its way out of the figures once the supply side starts to recover and the fractures are removed, they'll try to desist from putting interest rates up because of a fear of dampening demand too much and stopping the recovery.
Right. So he's going to have to run so the economies can recover in the way that they need to. I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that, John. Let's move it on a bit because there was a few topics that we had listed that we wanted to talk about today, and it's probably linked to this. Eshwar, I think, has also posted just a question about, you know, essential steps for improving supply chain in resilience as we go forward. But there was a survey that SIPS did recently on, you know, supply chain disruption, and the majority of supply chain managers thought the disruption would last for at least 6 months or more. And therefore, we're going to have to continue to live with this disruption, but then look for ways of overcoming it and addressing some of the challenges in there. And I know, Laura, that's something that's been sort of at the heart of some of the work that, you know, the construction group have been doing and you've been doing in construction, just looking at this fact that these are some major supply chain issues that they'll continue to face and won't go away in the short term. And I'd be interested, you can bring to life some of the specifics that you've seen in the construction sector on this.
Yeah, I mean, we took a different approach in the construction sector, having experienced everyone scrabbling around for information after the first lockdown of how much stock do we have in the country, what are the current lead times, where are the products from? Because in the construction industry, we're not great at supply chain visibility and transparency. We expect our suppliers to deliver. What we didn't know is when our boards were asking us, okay, tell us where our biggest risks are. Okay, I'll go away and just interview 100 suppliers and then come back to you with that information in about a month's time. That's too late. So we realized actually as a group, sometimes there are things you can do together. we're not good at collaborating, particularly in the construction industry. It's perceived as not the done thing. However, we realised that our supply chain was absolutely exacerbated by different questionnaires that were sent by different companies asking the same question, but in a different way. So not only were they trying to manage their demand planning and their productivity in their own manufacturing facilities, well, we were also adding a whole bunch of admin burden to them. So in the construction industry, we decided to actually pull together and provide one report. So we would split the categories out amongst both clients and main contractors who we're in competition with. And we would go and pull that information and create one supply matrix that would give us a really good RAG status of the key categories within construction. We then partnered with Build UK, who's a representative organisation in the UK who just represents the construction industry, but they're very powerful. So we collaborated with them, and they actually published this supply matrix that we created every month on their website, which meant that we could also not just influence our own individual organisations around, we've done this report, this is where the key risks lie, right, we'll go away and create our own business continuity plan around that. But we were also then reaching some of our small to medium-sized enterprises who wouldn't have had the capacity to be able to go and find out what the latest lead times were, where the components were sourced from. Did the manufacturing plants have enough spares in the country that when Brexit hit, are we going to be able to service our plants? So we did do quite a unique exercise, and it's not really just for the pandemic and just for Brexit. We think that we could do something similar around sustainability and getting some data and sharing that across the industry. So we did do something slightly different. And to be honest with you, one of the key takeaways from me was we need to collaborate more, not just with our suppliers, but also with our peers. We can really share knowledge and understanding of what we've been through over the last 2 years and really learn from that and just continually improve.
But I think off the back of that as well, Laura, is identifying those common issues, and then whether you need to collaborate to overcome them, whether that's bringing more suppliers in, helping to sort of manage demand better. I mean, some of that collaboration that you've been doing, as you say, hopefully that will not just reacting to the bad news, but also maybe starting to look at tackling things like sustainability, as you say, and some of the more positive, proactive approaches you can take in the supply chain.
Exactly. Demand planning, you just mentioned there, Duncan. We're not great at it in construction. And actually, to be honest with you, I think we can all say as procurers that actually sometimes we forget about the basics. We make things so complicated. We forget that there are some key basics here. Demand planning is key to the industry. Particularly construction. We need to provide that information to our manufacturers so that they can manage productivity. You know, there's going to be peaks and troughs, and that they can manage, but the lack of visibility is crazy. And then again, the supply chain visibility, it's just reinforcing some of these key skills that we have as procurers and that we have at our fingertips, just reminding ourselves that actually we need to do this more often.
Actually, next week's Supply Chain Talk that my colleague Sam's hosting is actually on demand planning. So if there's an opportunity to drill down into how to do it and better ways of doing it, hopefully that'll be picked up in a lot more detail next week. So hopefully people will get benefit from that as well. But I mean, John, what's this view that supply chain disruptions will last for at least 6 months or more going forward? The sort of disruptions we've got currently. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think, I think, first of all, I think that there's an added complexity of what is the reality of Brexit once COVID goes away. And who knows what that's going to reveal once we take that cloak away, as I said before. I think in terms of how long it will last, I honestly think we're taking a stab in the dark. Really what we need on this call is an epidemiologist who can give us some view as to what's likely to happen to COVID going forward, because that's going to determine the time frame. And again, if we go back and we ask the same question, or we look at the same question being asked 18 months ago, a year ago, 18 months ago, supply chain professionals are, at least another 9 months, John, but we'll be all right Q1 20 21, or we'll be all right Q2. And they thought they were sort of predicting far enough out. So essentially what you're finding people doing now is sort of throwing the can down the road as far as they can and hoping that that's the reality. I think what we have to do is exactly what Laura gave us a superb example of there, is accept the reality of where we are, accept what that reality requires of us as in terms of a challenge, in terms of demand side and supply side transparency, and get on working either as industry groups there or engaging with professional supply chain professionals and third parties. So our logistics companies, we should expect them to provide transparency. So, you know, DHL 360 is a product that attempts to do that. You know, Kuehne + Nagel Sea Explorer and Air Explorer trying to give you transparency of your supply chain. But to what extent is that just from, you know, from point to point, from port to port, or from door to door, which is great, but it doesn't still pick up transparency in some of those variables that exist outside that length of the supply chain. And then there are bureaus that are set up. We've done some work with at SIPS with an outfit called Risk Management or Risk Method, sorry. And again, these are people who are attempting to digitize your supply chain and give you transparency in terms of when stuff will arrive, where it is, what the delays are, what the expected delivery times are. And again, I think we have to ask more of our third-party supply chain partners to provide that transparency for us. So I think Laura provided an excellent example of what industry and industry groups can do, but I think our supply chain partners that we contract with, they're now on the hook to provide that transparency. And the thing is, the big ones are doing it, okay? But the bigger ones are tending to do it better for the bigger organizations. And when it comes to the smaller SMEs, they have to be aware that these tools are available and avail themselves of it where they can. Issue there might be cost of doing so.
Yeah, the issue might be cost, but you know, I suppose it's like all these things in supply chain. If you need to invest in these things, and often as procurement and supply chain professionals, we've often been starved of the budget that maybe we should have been getting to get that sort of data set, to get the tools in place, to do the analysis that maybe sort of our marketing colleagues would get some great sort of market research and demand stuff coming through, and they pay an agency to do it for them. But whenever we were asking for that money, we never really got it. And maybe that's starting to shift now, that actually it's recognized that we do need the data, we do need the insight, we need the information, and we need to pay to get the right quality of it rather than just doing it on a shoestring. And you know, in previous episodes here, we've talked about some of the technology and some of the platforms available, but it is up to probably supply chain professionals to make those investments to get that insight that they're looking for.
Yeah, well, I think as you hinted at there, Duncan, it's a good time because, you know, I think I said right at the beginning, you know, the procurement profession now is faced with this tension between resilience and getting stuff efficiently and productively. Now, in the past, because there was a function of too much of an emphasis on productivity and effectiveness, you were starved of that investment that was needed to build resilience. Now, you're invited to the boardroom because they want resilience, because they've seen what lack of resilience in supply chain can do to their business and the effectiveness of the business. So I think you're right. I think pushing an open door and the timing is great to get that investment that helps build resilience in supply chains.
Yeah. Sorry, Laura, you're going to come in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say the visibility of this information is so important. It actually eases tension within the supply chain. I actually, crazy to think, I started off my life in retail, and I go back to my thought around collaborating. There are other industries that have really kind of invested in this area and probably have insight to give to us and to share with us. I know the construction industry really hasn't had that data. We place an order and we get given a lead time, and we pretty much maybe get bit of a view as to, oh, come in this week or this day, but having that real-time information will help us increase that productivity on site. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's such an area of, well, it's an area that's suffered lack of investment.
Yeah, and I think the trend, what everyone's saying is that ability to really understand your supply chain. So it's that visibility and transparency down through it, but it's also just understanding how the supply chain works. And there's often been that discussion about, have you actually done your proper mapping? I think there's a comment from Eshwar about sort of looking at impact and criticality. So where are your risks? And what are the issues associated with those risks? And what are you going to do to address those risks? I mean, as you say, I worked in FMCG for 10 years. That was just something you did, and it became the norm to do because you had to keep everything going. And maybe it's just getting back to some of that good, detailed understanding of the whole supply chain rather than just the tier one or the distributor that you're dealing with. And I know in construction, that has been the issue, hasn't it? That people just going to distributor and saying, I just want one of these and give me one, rather than understanding where they came from in the first place.
Yeah, I think the industry was very naive going into the pandemic, and I would love to be the person who had the business continuity plan written around the supply chain, because most of it's around IT. But you're absolutely right. We had no idea where the products were coming from. And actually, you'd think in the construction industry, oh yeah, no, it's fine. It's local. It's UK manufacturers. Well, what about the components? What about the chemicals that we import for those particular products? Nobody knew, and I felt as embarrassed as my peers to say maybe we hadn't actually done a full view of what the whole supply chain looks like. And where are our pinch points? Where do we take things into certain ports? We had no idea. We didn't know what our exposure was. But doing this exercise has really helped me look at opportunities as well for both onshoring and potentially offshoring, and how we can kind of manage the whole supply chain.
I think that last point's quite critical, though, and it goes back to your FMCG point, Duncan. It's not only having the transparency and the data, but then it's having the agility to act on that and the capability to act on it quickly. And of course, if you've kind of grown up in a world where the supply chain just worked, okay, they're competencies that you haven't got. You haven't got the competencies to collect and collate that transparency data and then to act on it. And like you say, that has to be built really quickly. And the interesting thing there is that, that creates benefits in perpetuity. This is a competency and a capability that not only helps you navigate the chaos that we're talking about today, but actually helps you and prepares you for the new normal and then puts you in a much more effective and efficient position thereafter.
Yeah, and I think that probably comes. I think I've just seen a question pop up from, or in the chat from Joe Roberts, talking about what skills, experience, and training are needed to operate in this new environment. And I think John, you just touched on that. That understanding and being able to do a proper analysis and look at the data and interpret it in the right way, and then do some of the risk analysis. I mean, they're skills, aren't they? They're skills that you can develop and learn, and maybe there's a lot more focus on that skill set than maybe some of the commercial skills than we've always been used to having in supply chain. And maybe that's some of the shift that we're seeing here, and the need for people to go away and actually fully understand this environment, the risk environment, the options for doing sourcing differently. How do you develop a local supplier to replace a supplier that you're currently dealing with in China? That in itself is quite a scary thing to do, but a great opportunity if you can go ahead and do it in a different way. So the skill set's definitely shifting. I think we're seeing that collaborative skill set, the way of working with suppliers better, as being truly in demand at the moment from people.
Yeah, I'd say also every time I've worked with a new procurement team, one of the first things I say to them is be curious. Just go and ask questions. Go and find out things from your supply chain. Ask them if there are any inefficiencies. These are the skills that we need. People to ask good questions and to not just accept the status quo. We're all too used to, we always get things that way. Well, okay, well, why? And I remember when I first started out in my career, I asked a lift supplier what inefficiencies we brought. And he said, well, we manufacture in Spain and we bring your lifts in and we have to store them in England for you. Oh, okay, well, that's going to cost more. And there we go. I then asked, well, why? Because apparently we don't give a good date for them to come and deliver to site. So we don't stick to our program. So there are areas that you can always kind of question and be curious. And that for me, as the question asked, is a really key skill that we actually have naturally as procurers.
Yeah, and I think the other comment that's just come from Eshwar is also about change management being, that's not just understanding, but then if you see that there's something, then how do you manage that change? How do you get that change made through the supply chain and probably internally as well? Because there's a lot of things that you just said there you need to do internally to change things to help your supplier be able to do things better, more efficiently, and manage their own organization, their own company better.
Yeah, and that comes down to influence.
Yeah.
Something that is a softer skill, and you do have to be able to be able to influence your business, and that can be quite difficult, particularly in traditional businesses like construction. But it's key.
Yeah. And I mean, John, just one of the other sort of topics that we wanted to touch on was this view that economic data that this is around on supply chains and things like the Purchasing Managers Index. You touched on Producers Price Index. I mean, there's a lot of economic data that's around. How do you think we should be using that data to really help us to manage risk and resilience? What sort of insights does it give us that we're able to interpret data to then inform and then make decisions differently as we go forward?
I think so. So if you look at the PMI data, the great thing about the PMI data is it's a pretty good predictor of what's going to happen in the relatively near future. So if we see these trends or whatever variable that we're looking at, if the trend goes above 50, then the things are moving in the right direction, and you can act upon that with a relatively high degree of certainty with respect to the next 2 or 3 months. So you can start to react to seeing activity re-emerging, or in some instances prices increasing. I think in terms of the price data, my main criticism of that is the way in which it's produced means that you're essentially, if you're using that data, you're kind of driving the business while looking through the rear view mirror. Right. That's telling you what has happened in the past. If it gives you an insight in the way that I talked about in terms of, is it setting off mechanisms that are going to perpetuate inflation, or do we understand the mechanisms that are generating the inflation? Then if you can get that nuanced understanding, you can start to make business decisions on that basis. But looking at the plain numbers in terms of inflation figures is not going to tell you too much. You have to dig into it. Again, it's Laura's point. Be curious about what's causing that inflation. Ask a couple of relatively simple questions, and all of a sudden you then start to get information that will allow you to drive your business decisions going forward.
So what you're saying is there's not many leading indicators. There's a lot of lagging indicators. Yeah. And certainly, I think we're all looking for that. So what's going to happen next, and what's that predictor? And I know there's been a lot of stuff in commodities, of commodity trends and analysis, and do you hedge and so on. But it's always been a bit of a challenge to really trust them. And trust that they're actually going to give you the right prediction to make the right calls going forward. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is, and of course, essentially what you're looking at in those indices with lagging indicators is, do you buy the trend? Yeah, but then was it Galbraith that said a trend is a trend, but when will it bend? So that is the issue that you're looking at. So if you want to buy the curve, that's fine, but there are risks that are inherent with that. But again, you need to look at fundamentally what is driving those prices. Okay, and it's simple questions. Laura's saying, where do we get our suppliers from? What are the conditions? If we're buying chemicals in from Germany, if we're buying chemicals in from Far East, wherever they're coming from, what's driving the fundamentals in those markets? Okay, and all of a sudden, then we can start to make a decision about inflation going forward. And also to the point, particularly when we're dealing with chaos, if we know the factors that are driving, the inflation. So, when are freight rates going to come down in terms of sea rates? We'll start looking at COVID, start looking at the congestion figures. These are all, data you can see. Los Angeles, you can see pictures of the ships lined up waiting to go in. Now, the interesting thing there, is there's also data that we don't see. So a lot of the ships that want to go into Los Angeles are lying off Mexico. So they're 1,500 nautical miles away. Why? Because they can burn dirty diesel in Mexico because they're not being regulated there. So there are some nuances that, that make it difficult to see. But there's a lot of information out there, but look behind the numbers themselves. And I have to say, with the exception of the PMI is a great leading indicator. The numbers themselves tend to be lagging indicators, and we need to see what's driving them.
Yeah, thanks, John. And Laura, what's your take here? I mean, from your experience and knowledge of working in this space, how much have you used economic data to help you to really understand what's happening, and also what you should do next?
Well, I mean, as John quite rightly said, I think the PMI data is really good. I've certainly used it within my industry. Now, other data that exists, you have to be curious for it. I've managed to find data in all sorts of different sources. So bring back the data analyst is what I will say. You need to get really good data analysts in your teams again. We used to have them, but I think, again, a bit like the logistics function, it's an area and expertise that perhaps we've let go. Invest in that, because they can do an awful lot of work in finding the data. It is there. We have the great thing called the World Wide Web, and it's extremely useful. So yeah, for me, my point on this is more around, let's get that skill set back into procurement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I've heard a number of people talking about hiring those data analysts or data scientists and bringing them into the function as being an essential role to help to do some of that sort of mining and looking for the data in the right places. And I agree with you. It's essential. And we've lost some of those over the time as we've had to do some cutbacks. So I really appreciate that. We're about out of time. It's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed the input. So I think we sort of covered off most of the topics we were going to cover. There's been some great questions that have come in as well. So John and Laura, I really appreciate your input and your time today. As I said at the beginning, we give the Supply Chain Talk mug out to people who've contributed and given the best sort of questions. And I have to say, just in terms of volume of contribution today, it must go to Eshwar, who's given probably 4 or 5 questions, I think one of which Trudy went back to him and said, if we answered that one, we'd probably be here for the next 2 or 3 hours, which would be sort of challenging. But maybe, Eshwar, you've asked a few questions here that would be good topics for us to cover in future supply chain talks as well. So I really appreciate that, and we'll make sure we get a mug across to you. Next week, the supply chain talk is, as I said, focusing on demand planning and looking at that end-to-end visibility and real-time data. So while we've been talking about the supply chain and looking at the supply chain, demand planning and understanding how to do that well and effectively should be a really interesting topic as a follow-on from what we've been covering today. So as I said, my colleague Sam is hosting that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. But in the meantime, John and Laura, really appreciate your time today. It's been great to, as usual, to have you and to spend time talking with you about these important topics. So thanks for your time. And the audience, thank you for listening and to watching Supply Chain Talk this week. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.